Okay, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where in the world are you now. Welcome to the international seminar on US-Russian strategic relations after the Geneva Summit, hosted by the Center for Advanced American Studies at the Institute of International Studies of MGIMO University. Thanks for being with us today, and I'm happy to see so many familiar faces in the audience. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrei Baclitsky, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Advanced American Studies and the organizer of this event. Our center is the youngest at the Institute. It was created only this year, but we continue a rich tradition of American studies at MGIMO and will be doing more, so watch this space. The director of the center, Maxim Suchkov, is sending you his regards, as well as the director of Institute, Andrei Sushintsov. So the idea of the seminar, as the name implies, comes from the summit of President Biden and President Putin earlier this year. And the two of the most important issues on the agenda were arms control, and the only statement coming out of the summit was reaffirmation of Reagan-Gorbachev principle that nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought, and the other was cyber information security. But it was obvious that the summit will only be a beginning of the next round of efforts to deal with those issues in a bilateral manner. So next week, we'll have Russian-US consultation on ransomware. And sometime this month, there will be bilateral consultations on the strategic stability. So the timing could not be better to discuss where we go from Geneva Summit on arms control and on cyber, what is on the agenda, what is possible, what is probable, and what are the biggest unknowns. We will have about an hour for each topic, and we have a perfect US-Russian lineup today. I'm very grateful for everyone who took their time to share their wisdom with us. And special thanks to Oleg Shakirov from the Center of Advanced Governance, who was instrumental in putting together the cyber part. With this, I pass the floor to my colleague, research fellow at the Center for Advanced American Studies, Alexander Chekhov, who will be moderating the first session. Please, Alexander, the floor is yours.
Yes. Hello, colleagues. Nice to meet you all here. And I would like to introduce the first panel of this seminar, which is, as Andrei indeed mentioned, a number of brilliant speakers on the topic. And first of all, it's Mr. Baclitsky from the MGIMO. Then we have Mr. Konstantin Bogdanov from the Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Then we have Sэмюэл Charap from the CNA Corporation. And then we have Ms. Fink from the Center for Naval Analysis. And I would like to give the floor to Mr. Baclitsky to speak first. And then I would like to give the floor to Mr. Bogdanov, then to Mr. Charap, and then to Ms. Fink. And if you have any questions to the speakers, I greatly encourage you to post them into the chat box, and I will be then, and we will have the questions just, okay. And we will have the question session just after the speakers. Okay, so Mr. Baclitsky, please go on.
Thanks, Alexander, and sorry for stealing the spotlight, and I'm speaking again. I try to be brief, and the idea of this seminar is to speak, brief and to the point. So in July, we'll have strategic stability talks after almost a year of pause and pretty much starting from the scratch with the new US administration. Tomorrow is the last day of the Senate in session before the summer recess, and Bonnie Jenkins will probably not be confirmed as US Undersecretary of State for Arms Control. Dr. Fink might say more about this, but probably someone else from the state, someone who's already confirmed, will be heading US delegation. It could be Deputy Secretary Sherman or Undersecretary for Political Affairs Nuland, but not the top diplomat on the arms control side. We don't know much about those consultations. We heard unconfirmed media rumors that Russia agreed to discuss its tactical nuclear weapons and US agreed to discuss its missile defense. I don't think this is true, in a sense that there were some specific conditions agreed. It all seems for now very open-ended on both sides. US has not done its strategic planning documents, including the NPR. Its leaders, as we said, are not in place still. But this time, it seems to me, could and should be used for getting both sides on the same page, at least, on what they're talking about, on what types of systems and technologies are of greatest concern, maybe to agree that such and such systems have an impact on such and such other systems, and if the numbers increase and location changes, it impacts this and this. So getting to this point would be already a huge breakthrough. And to put it in terms of the latest Russian proposals, the sides will have to agree to a new, security equation and decide how to go from there. That would be the basis from which you can then start the real negotiations. This is still the consultations part. Once and if this is done, we'll have to move to the actual problem solving. As many of you probably know, I've been, suggesting this idea that we can move on the separate but connected tracks in those two negotiations, if we have them. One dealing with strategic nuclear forces, but also strategic conventional forces, if such will appear, keeping in mind that New START expires in 2026 and you cannot extend it any further. The second track could deal with missile defense and space security. And again, there have been a lot said because of why this could be the case. The lines between advanced missile defenses and anti-satellite weapons have been blurred, and it's hard to discuss them separately, really. Moscow is concerned with missile defense, US is concerned with safety of its satellites. There could be some room for compromise there, because I don't think US is simply interested in discussing missile defenses without getting anything in return. And the third and the final track could deal with pretty much everything else, non-strategic nuclear weapons and conventional precision-guided systems. And here as well, we would have to figure out how to deal with the fallout from the collapse of the INF Treaty, because those are precision-guided systems, be them conventional or nuclear. The Russian proposal for moratorium is still on the table. It now includes the much discussed SSC-8 or 9M729 missile. We've heard the recent NATO summit. This is a non-starter. No one gonna discuss anything like this with Russia because it's not a real proposal. But I still think that this is quite probably the most realistic and advanced proposal which is on the table. If there is a US counter proposal, I guess it should be discussed as well, but there simply isn't. And probably to close up, it would be interesting to watch if and when the normal working process, which we had before, will resume. We haven't had the bilateral consultative commission under the New START meetings since 2019. We had no inspections under New START since early 2020. And this precludes from working on the specific issues, especially the BCC, like Russian concerns with US modification of heavy bombers and SLBM launchers. We also have some other complaints on the compliance with the treaties on our plate. For example, the Biden administration still claims that Russia had engaged in low-yield nuclear testing It grandfathered this from the Trump administration, but it repeated it in its compliance report, basically saying, yes, we agree with that. And Bonnie Jenkins was asked about it specifically at her confirmation hearings, and she said, yes, we believe that Russia did that. So probably that would have to be clarified one way or the other. There was no actual clarifications before under the Trump administration. Biden administration would be wise to do something about this issue, because as we've seen before, if you just accuse Russia of something without providing any details and without trying to address this issue specifically, then the next Republican administration just comes and withdraws from the treaty. So it would be nice if the current administration, Biden administration, would do something about those issues. And I leave it here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Andrei, for your speech. And our next speaker will be Dr. Bogdanov from the Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Please go on, Konstantin.
Thank you, Alexander. First of all, I would like to say about strategic stability. We talk about strategic stability like something important and first thing to consider. But as for me, it's just a result of consequent considering of, most destabilizing systems, technologies, doctrines, and postures which have the participants of talks. And this is a problem because we now, I believe, exhausted the previous definition of strategic stability, which was forged in final form around the late 80s. In joint agreement of 1990, it was described like a situation when both sides have not incentives to use nuclear weapons first, but implicitly this formulation, this definition imply that it should be and it would be a massive disarming strike, counterforce strike, according to specific postures and specific doctrines and even the numbers of nuclear weapons deployed in both in Soviet Union and United States. And now we have completely different situation after all the deep cuts and horizontal nuclear weapons proliferation through the world. We have new technology factors like advanced long-range precision-guided capabilities, like cyber capabilities, like artificial intelligence, like most pressing regional issues, which actually undermine the core narrow definition of strategic stability, because now we, I believe, should talk about lowering the incentives to not only to conduct disarming first strikes, massive first strikes, but to lower incentives to any use of nuclear weapons. And that's the problem, because modern doctrines implies implies a single or limited use of nuclear weapons in regional scenarios to make nuclear deterrence more credible. That's a tricky situation because you actually create the nuclear capabilities which is more usable with low yield capability and precision guided nuclear capability actually. And you do something, you do all that for actually non-employment of nuclear weapons. That's contradictory. But for the next steps, for any development in strategic stability, we should first describe the strategic offensive arms, like a broad category, like a broad set of capabilities, because we should go beyond the nuclear weapons to the advanced precision-guided capabilities, long-range capabilities with counter-force potential, to the cyber capabilities, especially to electronic warfare capabilities, which could affect the nuclear command, control, and communication systems, which is the separate and very important possible topics for further strategic dialogue, because the resilience and survivability of NC3 systems is crucial in modern world, especially when we consider it like a resilience and survivability of combined systems, both for conventional forces and for nuclear forces, with this tendency to combine the both combat command and control systems is still pressure issue. I would say that both sides, the United States and Russia, have somewhat different points of view on what exactly should be the cornerstone of next, I'd say, arms control framework. Not the agreement per se, but maybe framework like a number of agreements, commitments, and other regimes. Russia mostly concerns about strategic offensive arms in broader definition, including precision-guided conventional capabilities and ballistic missile defense. United States, in most part of its concerns, talk about non-strategic nuclear weapons and capping all nuclear warheads in arsenals. I think it's a possible basis for trade-offs and hard bargaining, actually. But it's a very difficult situation in terms of combination into the into the joint legally binding agreement. I think it would be a simultaneous process via several tracks, several baskets, and it may result in completely different forms, from legally binding agreements to political commitments and unilateral initiatives like presidential nuclear initiative from 1991, 1992 about tactical nukes. And after that, I would say a couple of words about emerging technologies, because cyber topics is most pressuring according to the results of Geneva Summit. I would say that we are at very first stage in this process. We still not describe any specific joint vocabulary about cyber warfare, and we should do it before imply any restriction and limitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Konstantin, for your speech. And I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Fink.
Thank you so much. I will be brief because I really want to get to the discussion. We have a lot of international participants here, and I'm very curious to hear what their opinions on some of these things are. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I think I'll kind of make 3 points here, and they're all about how these strategic stability talks will actually be pretty challenging for 3 reasons. The first being that there's a lack of agreement on the agenda, right? As my Russian colleagues discussed, the United States wants to tackle all nuclear warheads, including non-strategic nuclear weapons and some of Russian niche nuclear capabilities. And this requires a very significant focus on verification, which will take a lot of technical work that hasn't even been begun by our technical and lab communities. And Russia wants a broader conversation about the strategic equation. And Andrei and Konstantin both described the Russian list of what's on that strategic equation. But I think it will actually take a long time to figure out what the threat perceptions are of both countries and what the actual trade space is, because I suspect that the United States isn't just going to kind of discuss the strategic equation, right? Because there's kind of other things that are of concern to the United States and our allies. The second reason that strategic stability talks will be challenging is perhaps because of the complexity of the issues under the strategic equation or security equation rubric. All the things under this rubric are incredibly complex on their own, and linking them, so issue linkage in arms control can be either, usually has a very negative history. It can be very difficult to make progress on things that are linked, that are of different domains. And there's also lots of different stakeholders in this, from military services in both countries to kind of MFA and MOD, on sort of Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the MOD on the Russian side to sort of the US counterparts. And the other part of it is that the United States is, some of our Russian participants have noted, is going through kind of figuring out what the strategies are going to be, from the national defense strategy to the missile defense review to the nuclear posture review. And some of these things will take time to shake out. I think there have been public remarks by US officials saying that some of these things may be ready as early as next year. So I think while this dialogue is happening between the United States and Russia, I think it's wise to sort of figure out kind of what are the things that we're going to be willing to talk about. So progress will be very, very slow on these things. I would personally be very curious to learn about the Russian delegation and who's heading it and how the MOD and MFA views are balanced on the delegation. And sort of the third reason I think that strategic stability talks will be challenging is the sort of the fragility of the bilateral relationship. I think despite the fact that President Biden and President Putin met, the political relationship and the diplomatic relationship still remains very frail. Right, there's still, the embassies are closed. There's lack of kind of consular muscle in the U.S. embassy in Moscow because of some of the restrictions that the Russian counterparts have imposed. And so I think we shouldn't forget that while the two sides are negotiating, the diplomacy, kind of the actual diplomatic relationship is kind of at a standstill, and any crisis potentially can tip that, and that remains a significant challenge. So with that, I'll just say that I think there's no reason not to talk about strategic stability, right? We all have our lists, we all have our solutions, and some of them are exciting and very interesting, and some of them may actually, become policy as the two sides talk about these issues. But again, there's a lot of hurdles that we still need to overcome, and they will take some time and they will be very difficult. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Fink. And I would like to pass the floor to our last speaker, Sэмюэл Charap. Sam, please go on.
Thanks, and thanks to Andrei and MGIMO for the invitation to speak today. I'm also going to be brief, as Andrei requested. Just 3 points and perhaps one suggestion for how we go forward. My colleagues, of course, have said a lot, most of which I agree with. So I'm left without much to say at the end, but I think just taking a step back, we can say that, we should say that it's good that both sides have sort of agreed to have a wide-ranging, and it seems without preconditions in terms of what the agenda should be, dialogue on strategic stability. I think many of us observing this process have called for such a dialogue for years, and we should applaud the governments that they're getting it underway in a way that is, it seems, inclusive of both sides' concerns, that they're not going to be things left off the table that really matter to one or the other side on this set of issues. The second issue, which colleagues have touched upon, which I think is important to underscore, is that when it comes to what potential future agreements should be that cover the kinds of capabilities and concerns that have been raised today, and also by the governments and themselves, we don't really have models to go on, or at least we don't have existing agreements that can be easily taken off the shelf and adapted. we should remember that New START, as important as it was, ultimately was a modernization of an agreement that had been around for nearly 20 years at the time, and an agreement itself, START 1, that was derived from the earlier strategic arms limitations endeavors in the 1970s. So that model we know well, dealing with, that is, deployed strategic offensive weapons and their delivery systems, and particularly in how to inspect and verify those. But as far as the other kinds of capabilities that the sides are concerned about, we are to a certain extent starting with somewhat of a blank page. There have been ideas put out there, of course, but the governments themselves are not versed in those, or not don't have those practices that they can pick up off the shelf. And that gets me to my third point, which is that I think the main challenge for these talks is going to be time, actually, the time factor. I think time is the enemy in a way. The way it seems that they're being structured is not a regular mechanism of negotiations or consultations at this stage, but rather sort of periodic meetings. And one would imagine that at this point, we're not talking about more than 2 this year, and one would expect maybe 4 next year, but that would be a big lift if we're doing sort of non-regularized consultations. That is, they're not standing teams sitting in Geneva or Vienna and negotiating, but rather sort of agreeing a date and flying in. That is not a format that lends itself to quick agreements, and the clock is ticking. So New START, of course, will expire in 2026, and I don't think we want to find ourselves in the same position we were at the beginning of this year, where scrambling has to happen to ensure that a framework to address the capabilities that are addressed by New START is in place. There are 2 other reasons why time is a challenge, and that is the sort of politics of the summits as they have emerged in the U.S. discussion. I think there's a desire, at least the press popular criticism of the summit is that there weren't deliverables, and the promises after the summit, at least from the U.S. side, is that there will be, or there should be some, and we'll be able to sort of judge the success of the summit based on whether deliverables emerge in the next 6 months. I don't think that we can expect these talks to produce those kinds of deliverables in the next 6 months. I'd be very pleasantly surprised if they did. But I think that political calendar and the reality of the complexity of the issues that are on the table might not merge. And the third problem with time, which Anya alluded to, is that, as we have seen in U.S.-Russia relations in the last 7 years, particularly, stuff happens, and it tends to be unfortunate and destabilizing stuff in the U.S.-Russia context. And we don't really have the resilience in place in the relationship to expect that these talks will be sort of immune to potential crises happening that are unrelated to them. So finally, how to deal with that problem, one thought I had, I think, and this might be eventually where things go, is that the sides might want to think about separating the issues into time-sensitive ones and less time-sensitive ones. I would put in the time-sensitive basket some sort of framework to ensure that the verification, limitations, and inspection regime of New START is preserved beyond 2026, and that we are able to avoid a confrontation over deployments of intermediate range ground-based missiles. Those are, it seems to me, time sensitive. There are clocks running on those. and then have a sort of less time-sensitive, more conceptual, perhaps more broad reaching discussion on concepts and approaches to dealing with the relatively novel, for arms control, sets of capabilities that are now on the table, or at least the sides have said they want to be on the table.
Thank you, Tim, for your speech. And we have quite an excellent timing because we have nearly half an hour for the discussion. And we already have some questions in the chat box, but since we have time, I would like to start from my own question as a moderator, first of all. And I would like to ask the panelists, what do they think about the idea which was on the table back at the when Donald Trump was the president of the United States, about including new states in the US-Russia strategic negotiations process. And first of all, China. Will this idea be just dropped, or will the United States try to pursue it forward in some way? Yes, Andrei.
Yeah, from what at least my US colleagues can correct me, from what I've heard and seen from the Biden administration, there seems to be a clear statement that they wish to pursue bilateral tracks. So one with Russia, one possibly with China, not to mix them. And it's quite surprising that, I guess, yesterday or the day before yesterday, there was an article by Dmitry Suslov in the Russia in Global Affairs, where he specifically analyzed this trilateral proposal and said that it's against Russia's interests and shouldn't be pursued. But it seems that it's not really on the agenda. So I was surprised that this is still discussed, and it's discussed more, it seems, in Russia than it's discussed in the United States.
Thank you. And I also see, Samuel, you wanted to speak on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not 100% clear where the administration is on this, so I won't speak for them. But I would say that, you know, regardless of what the U.S. wants, or Russia wants for that matter, like, there is the problem of the reality of Chinese policy, and so I think we can say that we want them there or that they should be involved, but, you know, it's pretty clear that that's not going to happen. So eventually, just as with the administration that was much more insistent that at least these talks be trilateral, if that was an actual genuine position, that we're not going to end up in that place because the Chinese aren't going to be involved. That having been said, you know, you could imagine a more robust, as they say, P5 process that would involve China as well as the other permanent members of the UN Security Council, nuclear weapon states, to address issues related to strategic stability. But I imagine that we're going to end up with a bilateral track that addresses the bilateral issues, because the US-Russia bilateral strategic relationship is unique.
Thank you. And then we are going to the chat, and I will just read the questions which are being asked. And I'll also encourage, if you have your questions, please post them to the chat box. First question came from Jeffrey Arnold, and the question is, do any of the panelists see any low-hanging fruit that might generate some goodwill or even trust that will be necessary to address the big issues, follow-on for NST, for example? And I think, Dr. Fink, you would like to follow on this one? Yes, please go on.
Yeah, so I think what you saw in the Geneva Summit statement was the low-hanging fruit, right? You saw the statement that a nuclear war should not be fought and cannot be won. This is something that civil society has demanded for a long time, and I suspect that it was also intended to sort of support the nuclear non-proliferation treaties to kind of buttress some of those treaty tendencies, especially as the nuclear ban treaty came into force this year. I suspect sort of as the delegations start meeting, there may be some other statements that could be made. But I think those are going to be a little bit more difficult to work out and figure out. But again, this was a big step for the delegations, kind of making that statement, and also having it be restated to some extent in the Russia-China document that came out last week. So you're seeing some very interesting kind of movements in terms of declaratory policy. But again, I suspect that this was the low-hanging fruit, and things that remain are going to be much more challenging.
Thank you, Dr. Fink. And I would like to ask Mr. Baklицkий to follow on because I see the raised hand. Andrei?
Yeah, I don't know, low-hanging fruit on the US side, I would think, would be to agree to consider Russian concerns with missile defense, even without agreeing to anything specific, just saying, yeah, this is something we're willing to talk. That would be a big breakthrough, and we hadn't had any discussion of sorts since 2014, I guess. So it's been, what, 7 years? And that would show at least that US seems to be serious, and there is, space for maneuver, and it will be, I guess, in Russia, that would be easier for people who maybe are more interested in dialogue with the United States, maybe more open to having some trade-offs and something to say to their government, look, we can have some movement here, so maybe we can go deeper with some other issues. So that would be my low-hanging fruit. I don't know how long-hanging is it, but it seems like a possibility.
Thank you, Andrei. And I also see that we will have Dr. Bogdanov, who is willing to speak on this issue.
Yes, I think the only possible low-hanging fruit is any sets of the conflicting measures, conflicting building measures, and political commitments about de-escalation in zones where the mutual military activity is very high. Over Baltics, over Black Sea, over Middle East, and if we talk about United States-China's relation, it's South China Sea. So I don't think that any legally binding or intrusive measures and agreements could be reached in terms of low-hanging fruits. But if we want just to cool down the situation, these measures can be very helpful.
Thank you, Konstantin. And we are going to a second question, which was expressed by Bruce McClintock. Thanks for the opening remarks. Do you see any indications in the new Russian national security strategy for greater optimism, pessimism about strategic stability discussions? In the Russian NSS, is the Russian NSS even a valid indicator of overall Russian thinking, or is it disconnected from the actual policy thinking at the highest levels? I would like to ask the panelist who is willing to speak on this question. Yes, Andrei.
So is the Russian national security strategy a valid indicator of overall Russian thinking, or is this connected from the actual policy thinking? I would say it's very much a valid indicator of overall Russian thinking, and I think the biggest problem of it's that it's a very broad indicator of all of the Russian thinking. So basically, the national security strategy is every conceivable goal or interest or policy or, Russian thinking put together in a single document. So my biggest problem with NSS is to just get out of it what priorities are, because it seems that everything is a priority and then nothing is a priority. Russia was open to strategic stability discussions under Trump. Russia is open to strategic stability discussions under Biden, so I don't think we really need to look to national security strategy for cues on it. There is enough statements from high-level political leaders, including President himself, that, discussions are on the table and we could be optimistic, but then we'll see how it goes.
Thank you, Andrei. And we also have Dr. Fink. Yes, please go on.
I would, I agree with Andrei, but I would also say that the tone of the national security strategy document suggests that Russia is much less optimistic about international cooperation and is kind of looking inward a little more. So if that's kind of I don't know if that's kind of an optimism pessimism thing, but I think there's more sort of realistic expectations given the sort of the current security environment.
Thank you. Yes, and I also see Dr. Bogdanov. Yes,
just a brief remark. Yes, the tone of national security strategy is quite not optimistic, but it's mostly domestic focused. In terms of arms control and pursuing of strategic stability, new national security strategy is mostly irrelevant to any changes. Actually, it's the same course which was 5 or 10 years ago. Mostly, in terms of arms control pursuing, as for me.
Thank you. And now we are going to our third question, which is addressed by Elena Chernenko from the Russian media outlet Kommersant. And she asks, Sergei Ryabkov indicated that Russia does not mind preserving the working groups established during the Trump administration. Do the speakers support that idea or think that another set of groups is needed? Anybody willing to follow on this question? Yes, Andrei.
Yeah, so since I've already laid down my version of groups, I would say that those could be improved. But I mean, the previous groups were space, which is very specific. Then there was doctrines, and there was the one on warheads or something. So it was, it seemed much more reflecting the interest of the United States than Russia. So missile defense was nowhere to be found. The warheads was mainly about pressuring Russia to talk about its non-strategic nuclear weapons. So I think that there should be some adjustments made, and I imagine, because Sergei Ryabkov also said that whatever discussions there will be, they won't be one-sided, and Russia would always push to talk for things it wants, which were not necessarily reflected in, at least in the names of groups. But again, as I said, you can discuss missile defense in space group, and you can discuss, INF moratorium in, in the warheads group. It doesn't matter that much what exactly are the names of the group if you're discussing the things that people are interested about.
Thank you, Andrei. And I think that I would like to combine the next two questions in one, and because they are all related about some sort of multilateral format for the future strategic stability talk. And the question is, which is more feasible for multilateral achievements, trilateral or P5 wide achievements? Because while China is a tough client, France might be ever tougher. And we also have a question from Intan Bidisa, who would like to hear what Russia and the United States done so far to persuade China to have strategic trilateral talks. Overall, the question is about, once again, the possibilities about the expanding the number of states which participate in this strategic stability talks. And I see, Andrei, you raised the hand. Oh, okay. Anybody would like to speak on this?
I'll just maybe say briefly that, yes. To Dima's question, that it depends on what you want to accomplish, right? So what your objective is. I think if there's an issue that better fits the trilateral discussion, then have it in the trilateral context. But so far, the kinds of broad issues that have been on the table and the way the P5 process has approached those issues, that is not seeking sort of legally binding agreements, it seems like the P5 process is appropriate for that kind of those kinds of discussions. But if you're looking, I mean, if there is a specific strategic issue that has that's more appropriately addressed in the trilateral context, then perhaps that you could imagine that being a more appropriate format.
Thank you, Sam. And I would like to give the word to Dr. Bogdanov, then to Mr. Baklицkий?
Well, it's all about agenda and focal points. We, I think, somewhat agree that trilateral intrusive arms control, the US, Russia, China, it seems infeasible now for many reasons. For the nature of Russian-Chinese relations, for the Chinese threat perceptions, and their view on security interests. But if we talk about more broad and maybe vague agenda through the P5 process, in terms of data exchange, in terms of confidence building measures, in terms of any other measures to improve, atmospheric conditions, so why not? But any intrusive agreements on multilateral basis, just infeasible.
Thank you, Konstantin. Please go on.
Yeah, so I don't know. I for once would probably be a devil's advocate, and I would say that actually trilateral arms control with China, Russia, and the United States would be in Russia's interest and probably in Chinese interest, because again, as I was saying for many times, you would have two sides on the table. Against one side, the United States. Russia and China have pretty much similar concerns, missile defense, space, now INF range systems, which wasn't previously concerned for China. So, and US seems to be more interested in getting something from China. So Russia and China together could get a better deal that they could get separately. With that said, I would just echo what Sam said. China is not interested. If China is not interested, it's hard to get to the table a party which is not interested. And Russia obviously doesn't have leverage to do that. I liked Dima's question about France. France indeed is tough, but I just remind you that it's not France who's increasing its nuclear arsenals and adding ambiguity to its nuclear doctrine. So maybe Brits would be even a tougher client.
Thank you, Andrei. And we have 12 minutes left, and we have also a number of questions. So I cannot say if we will be able to take all of them, but let's try. Next question comes from Artem Kvartalnov, who asks, can we expect changes in US-Russia nuclear security dialogue amid evolving perception of US nuclear presence in Europe, including intensified domestic political discussions surrounding nuclear sharing in Germany? Dr. Fink, please go on.
I think that's an interesting question. I would argue that these debates and domestic political debates in Europe and NATO countries are rather cyclical, right? They happen periodically for various reasons of domestic politics in these countries. And I view them personally as a NATO issue rather than a bilateral issue, sort of an issue that'll be captured in the talks between the United States and Russia. But I think this is also an interesting question for the Russian side, right? We keep talking about China, we just brought in France, but Sergei Ryabkov in his remarks also noted that still the Russian position of potential interest in removal of weapons from Europe and also potentially including the UK and France in talks. And I would love to hear from sort of our Russian participants about what that position currently looks like. Is that a position that they expect to remain steady, or is it going to change and evolve? Because I think in the past, we've sort of seen that position evolve.
Mr. Baklицkий, would you like to make a comment on this?
Yeah, so Russia's current precondition for discussing tactical nuclear weapons, Russian tactical nuclear weapons, is withdrawal of US non-strategic nuclear weapons from Europe, meaning from those European countries. I don't know how realistic that is, and it doesn't seem really realistic. So it might be just a stopgap to say that Russia is not just interested in talking about its non-strategic nuclear weapons by putting a condition which probably not gonna be implemented anytime soon. But on the flip side, US has withdrawn its nuclear weapons from Europe before, and the world did not end. Greece, UK, there are no more US nuclear weapons there. Cohesion of alliance apparently wasn't tarnished, and so on and so forth. So it seems that in the last years, this issue is getting more and more like put together with transatlantic solidarity, and it's almost like NATO will disintegrate if you move out those tactical nuclear weapons, and that's why everybody should stay together, hold the front, buy nuclear capable aircraft, and etc., 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 which I don't know how productive that is, but it seems that every year is getting harder to do something about those weapons, unlike in the 90s or early 2000s, when they were see like, yeah, they are there, but they don't really have military utility, so we might as well move them out if something happens. Like the biggest actually issue of maybe we should remove something from somewhere was the Turkish coup, and then the, you know, cooling of relations with Turkey, but even that, it doesn't seem had much of the movement.
Thank you. And Dr. Bogdanov, you also want to speak on this?
Yes, there is one possible way is to declare the tactical nukes in Europe as deployed, actually, and impose some kind of ceilings for deployed nuclear warheads, but not only for tactical, not only for non-strategic, but for some kinds of strategic warheads, which is actually now in the storages on the heavy bombers bases on Konos and Russia, 5 bases, and it could be start for more intrusive process in terms of storage warheads.
Yes, Andrei.
If I may just answer that. So another thing which Russia has been stating as of lately is that we should take into consideration all the nuclear weapons which can have strategic role. So that is very connected to where they are based. So from this point of view, US strategic nuclear weapons in Europe, from which they can be delivered by tactical aircraft to Russian borders, would be strategic. So that wouldn't even imply that Russia is now talking about its non-strategic nuclear weapons. It just would say that you have to add those to US, you know, ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers. And I guess, yeah, this is one way how you can include them. I'm not sure United States would be super on board with that, but maybe our US colleagues could comment on that.
Well, it seems like there are two ways of thinking about non-strategic nuclear weapons in this context. There's either the warhead problem, right, which we've sort of all been, the previous, my colleagues have been discussing, and the potential of addressing them in the context of addressing warhead numbers, or there's location, right, which in a way is implicit in the Russian demand that the US preemptively withdraw. But if we put that, the substance of that to the side and think about what's driving it, right, that is about where they are based and not their general existence, and which perhaps suggests an alternative to the warhead approach, which is maybe a trade on where they are deployed. I'll leave it at that because I don't know that there's a better idea about what that happens. But we've had agreements that result in certain classes of weapons being moved or being banned from deployment within certain areas. And that might be a different approach with non-strategic nuclear weapons.
So you suggest moving them to Portugal?
I suggest that it might be more plausible to consider them in the context of their range than their warhead numbers.
Okay, thank you. And I think that we have time only, unfortunately, for the last one question. I think that there is a number of questions by which go further, but unfortunately, it's only 5 minutes left. And I would like to take the question from Tinatin Japaridze. She asks, which such varying treatment of cybersecurity and information security in terms of US vs Russian official strategies? not in the least regarding terminology, approaches, and the general treatment of the domains? Can we still expect real progress in bilateral talks if the two sides continue to view some key points from rather different angles?
If I may suggest, we can just leave this for the second session, because we have like a separate hour discussing cyber and information security, so maybe it just moves there.
Okay, why not, actually, because the next session will start like really soon, and we will have an opportunity to ask for this question. Then we have actually a great number of questions from the John Mallory. I counted 9 questions, and I would like to ask John which question is the most important for him, which he would like which one is the most interested. If he can indicate, I think we can take this one question easily. John, are you with us? John Mallory seems he asked a lot of questions, but probably John. I would look at the organizational and cognitive capacity of the governments. Can you please tell me the number of questions? John, excuse me.
I think it's 8.
Question 8. Yes. Do the arms control establishments have the cognitive capacity to handle so many destabilizing issues simultaneously? Who would like to speak on this? Yes, Dr. Fink.
It's an interesting question, and I wouldn't put it as cognitively, because I think we have incredibly bright people in both the United States and Russia working these issues. But I would posit that I think what I was getting at in my remarks is there's kind of a bureaucratic challenge, because a lot of these issues touch different domains. They touch different military services. They touch different stakeholders in the government. And so I think kind of figuring out what their positions are, and it becomes a complex multi-level game very quickly in terms of figuring out a position. So I would argue that this is kind of potentially a bureaucratic challenge on both sides, because there's not necessarily an arms control establishment on either side. There's stakeholders from different parts of the government.
Thank you, Dr. Fink. And I would like to thank all the panelists and all the speakers and all the participants for coming to this panel. And our time is over for this one, but we will have the next panel, which we will be talking about the cybersecurity, and which will be moderated by my colleague from the Center of Advanced American Studies, Dr. Igor Istomin. I wonder if he is with us. Igor?
Yes, hi.
Igor,
do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well, and I would like to pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you so much, the panelists of the previous panel. I think it was a fascinating discussion, and we will just try to continue it and to maybe touch upon some of the questions that were posed for the previous panelists, but in the context of cyber information security. It is a great privilege for me to moderate this session and to be here. As Alex introduced me, my name is Igor Istomin. I'm also coming from MGIMO University. And of course, in discussion of Russian-American relations, there is a tendency sometimes to draw an opposition between nuclear issues and strategic arms as a kind of traditional issue area on the one side, and an emerging domain of cyber and information security. But I would also recall that we have cyber and information security issues on the agenda between Moscow and Washington for quite some time already, for more than a decade, and we have already a long record of failed attempts to achieve compromise or to achieve a sustainable compromise. Starting, we could recall the 2013 agreements between then Obama administration and Moscow, or announcement of consultations with the previous administrations, which did not necessarily happen in the last 4 years. So perhaps the main difference between the issues that we discussed in the previous session and the ones that we discuss now is not the novelty of the later, but that the strategic stability and arms control actually remained an area of greater dialogue and cooperation than cyber and information security for many years. And we had somewhat kind of concerned and somewhat dark comments in the previous session, but we know that the cyber and information security issues caused major disagreements between Russia and the United States in recent years, and that's the most perhaps problematic area in relations. But after Geneva, we expect to have a fresh start of discussion on this sensitive and problematic topic. And so we have an absolutely amazing panel now to discuss these issues and the way forward. And it is my great pleasure to welcome our prominent speakers at this session, including Oleg Shakirov, a senior expert from the Center for Advanced Governments here in Moscow. My colleague Elena Zinoveva, Deputy Director at the Center for International Information Security, Science and Technology Policy at MGIMO University. Dmitry Alperovich, Executive Chairman, from Silverado Policy Accelerator. And Erika Borghardt, a Senior Fellow at the Technology and International Affairs Program at Carnegie. So for the benefit of the discussion, following recommendations from Andrei, I would ask our panelists to limit their initial remarks to no longer than 5 minutes. And when you will pass the 4-minute mark, I would put a sign like right now on the screen. I hope you all see it. It is not only a reflection of that I agree with everything that you say, but also a sign that you have 1 more minute. And I also, similarly to Alexander in the previous panel, I would encourage all in our audience to post your questions in chat section. And after initial remarks, I will try to have as many questions answered by our participants as possible, starting from the question from Tina Tin, as it was already suggested. So the panelists could also prepare for this question. So with without any further ado, let me give the floor to Oleg, and please.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid, and thank you to MGIMO for organizing this. Yeah, I will start with some remarks. So I will not repeat what was said at the summit. I think it was quite expected if you followed what was happening before the summit. There was several prominent attacks, but there were also calls from Russia and from the United States for some kind of cooperation. It's unclear what will happen, but we had this lowest kind of denominator of launching some kind of new consultations. And this week it was reported that some kind of consultations will take place next week already. The White House said that ransomware will be discussed in particular. And Russian ambassador Anatoly Antonov confirmed yesterday that indeed there would be some consultations, but we don't know what will be the topic yet. So we had actually after the summit, we had some signals from Russia. I would just briefly like to mention them. So first, we heard from the head of the Federal Security Service, the FSB, that Russia is ready to cooperate with the United States in line of what was discussed between the two presidents. And he said, he was not very detailed, but he said that Russia was hoping for some reciprocity. And he also mentioned in this context the threat of attacks on critical infrastructure. This is definitely a sign of willingness to cooperate. We've heard the same from Ambassador Antonov yesterday, where he told Bloomberg that Russian agencies will make every effort to stop illegal actions from the territory of Russia. We also heard some kind of more restrained comments from the foreign ministry. For example, Sergei Rybkov, deputy foreign minister, said that while the United States attaches great importance to fighting cybercrime, Russia wants to have a more comprehensive discussion of information security. So it will be a challenge to balance the interests of each side. So we definitely have some demonstrated interest on the Russian side, and we'll see what it will lead to. So I would like to speak briefly on two issues that could be discussed. One is definitely cybercrime. And I know there was a lot of speculation in the United States whether it was possible to cooperate with Russia on fighting cybercrime, what are some challenges, etc. So I think it's definitely possible. We don't have too much, at least publicly, we don't know too much about law enforcement cooperation between Russia and the United States, but there is some even after this period of worsened relations between our two countries. For example, there is a cooperation on countering drug trafficking. In December of last year, the FSB actually said that they cooperated with the US Justice Department and were able to seize a big pack of cocaine somewhere in the Moscow region. There is some counterterrorism cooperation. So 2 years ago, President Putin thanked President Trump for providing a tip to Russia about some terrorist attacks that were being prepared in Russia, and he said that it was helpful in preventing those attacks. And there is another notorious case from 2011 where FSB warned the FBI about the Tamerlan Tsarnaev, which did not materialize, but it was demonstrates that there is some kind of intelligence sharing. I went back even further and found some examples of cooperation on internet-related threats. So, for instance, this is from a very different era, but in the middle of 2000s, the United States' main concern in terms of cybersecurity was internet piracy, and actually. One particular website, all of MP3, was the subject of negotiations between Russia and the United States, and ultimately in 2006 there was some kind of agreement between our two countries, and this led to the closing down of this website. Again, so some kind of threat. And if we go even further back, there was a cooperation between Russian Ministry of Interior and UK National High-Tech Crime Unit in 2005, where the two countries were able to stop a group that DDoSed a sports betting website in the United Kingdom and actually took as ransom about $4 million. So it was a very close cooperation, and they managed to prosecute 3 of those guys. So, of course, it will be a challenging test to do because you need to share some information. There is very little trust. So this is a challenge. There are political, of course, considerations on each side. But I think it's definitely possible to do. And because I ran out of time, I will discuss other issues later on. Thank you. And I give the floor back to Igor.
Thank you so much, Oleg. Perfect timing. And now I'm preparing to give the floor to Yelena. For some reason, we don't see you. Now we see you. Oleg already spoke about some issues which could be of common interest to Russia and the United States. But many scholars, including you yourself, previously were saying that Russia and the United States have often very different agendas and understand information and cybersecurity in different ways. So how do you think it could affect further negotiations after the summit?
Thank you very much, colleagues. Actually, it's difficult to add anything after such a comprehensive report by Oleg, but I'll try. Answering the question by Igor, what can be the main points of disagreement? what, in my opinion, is different is the approach towards the global regulation of the cyberspace. While United States of America and their advocates and like-minded countries, they suggest a rule-based international cyber order, and these rules for the cyber order should be elaborated within a narrow group of like-minded countries. Russia suggests that there should be norms, rules, and principles of responsible states' behavior in the global information sphere, which should be negotiated on a global basis. However, bilateral relations and bilateral agreements, including the ones between Russia and the United States of America, should form the basis of the global information security regime. If we're speaking about Russian interest in the international cooperation in information in the field of international information security, the most important recent document is the basics of the Russian state's policy in the field of international information security, which was adopted on the 14th, as far as I remember, of April this year. And this document is very much oriented towards the international cooperation. So it mostly focuses the Russian foreign policy efforts in this area in global, regional, and bilateral cooperation. Thus, the relations with the United States of America, which is, of course, undoubtedly one of the centers of power in the global information sphere, are of utmost importance for Russian Federation. Another problem which may be, well, answering again Igor's question, difficult to negotiate may be the problem of attribution, because what we see in the approach of the United States of America is public attribution of cyber attacks without well, negotiation. And according to, well, in my view, it's not an official position how I see this can be of difficult, this can be a tough issue for negotiation, is the issue of attribution, because before public attribution, there should be international negotiations which would kind of set some standard of attribution of cyber threats and cyber attacks. So this is how I can answer the question by Igor. Again, speaking about cybercrime and difficulties in cooperation in the field of cybercrime prevention, again, if we see the recent news, Russia recently ratified just a couple of days ago the agreement among the states members of Commonwealth of Independent States of 2018. So again, this is seen as a regional basis for the global treaty for the cybercrime prevention. And again, bilateral cooperation, regional cooperation, and global cooperation are seen as steps towards the formation of international information security regime. So this is the answer to the question. I have my report. If it's necessary, I can read through it, or it can be like answering a question. Don't know the format. So that's it.
It's fine. Thank you so much, Yelena, for sharing your perspective. I think you already provided a very important incentive for our discussion. And maybe we could go now to Dmitry. And we heard a lot from our Russian colleagues about what is Moscow's perspective on these cyber information security issues. What do the United States, what does the United States expect from a potential dialogue with Russia on these issues?
Thank you for having me. Well, of course, I can't speak for the United States. I'm simply a private citizen, so I'll give you my view of what are the issues of concern. Overarchingly, I would say it's very important. Cybersecurity is a very technical topic, so it's very important to talk about specifics. It's great to talk about rules-based orders and the like, but it doesn't actually help the problem. Similarly to the way we just discussed nuclear weapons, it was important to talk about ballistic missiles, tactical nuclear weapons, range numbers, and so forth. Similarly, we have to dive into the details when to discuss cybersecurity to actually differentiate and disentangle the various issues that are at stake. So from my perspective, I think there are 6 issues of concern to the United States when it comes to Russian behavior in cyberspace. First, there is the espionage activity that most advanced nation states conduct against each other, both in traditional physical world as well as in cyberspace, to include the United States. The SolarWinds attack that the United States has attributed to the SVR falls into that category. I've personally written that I don't view that operation as beyond the existing established norms, given that it was fairly constrained and limited to espionage targets. However, the US government reserves the right to respond to espionage, of course, both in the physical realm and in the cyberspace. So traditionally, both Russia and the United States, when they identify spies working for foreign governments on their soil, they arrest them. They don't pat them on the back and say espionage is acceptable. So you traditionally see some sort of response from countries when they detect espionage activity. So that's issue 1. Issue 2 is economic espionage. This is primarily an issue that is of significant concern to the United States vis-a-vis China. China has been stealing a lot of intellectual property from virtually everywhere in the world, to include, by the way, Russia, and providing it to domestic industries to give them an unfair advantage. But we have seen on occasion in a few specific industries, Russian intelligence services conducting economic espionage against American companies. And of course, the US government views that as a violation of norms. The third area of concern is prepositioning of access in critical infrastructure. This refers to the attacks we had seen, or the intrusion, I should say, we had seen in our energy sector back in 2014 and 2015, where the malware that was attributed to Russian intelligence called Black Energy was detected within a number of utilities in the US critical infrastructure sector. And while that malware was not used for any destructive purpose, there was an understandable concern on the part of the US government of why was that malware there? What purpose does it solve? There was no economic espionage benefit to extract from those utilities. So there was concern that that malware was prepositioned for potential destructive use should we get into a conflict. And of course, any country would find that unacceptable. The fourth area is the indiscriminate use of destructive attacks that intentionally target civilian infrastructure or unintentionally affect civilian infrastructure. And this refers to the NotPetya attacks, which originally targeted Ukraine, but of course, because of their indiscriminate nature, ultimately spread beyond Ukraine and impacted a number of companies around the world, including companies in the United States, and caused hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage. I'm also referring to the Olympic destroyer attacks on the Olympics in Korea in 2018. The United States used all of those as unacceptable and beyond the pale. The next area, the fifth area, is election interference. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about that for the last 4 years, the use of stolen material that may have been gotten initially for espionage purposes, but then leaked publicly in order to try to influence the political process in the United States, as we saw in 2016, as we saw in France in 2017, and so forth, as well as the use of troll farms to do influence campaigns on social media. But the most important issue above all else right now is unquestionably ransomware. The United States right now is facing devastating attacks on an almost weekly basis against our pipelines, against our meat processors, against our hospitals. The latest attacks over the weekend targeted small and medium businesses all over the country, such as dental offices and real estate agents and the like. And it is simply not acceptable for any president not to respond to those continuous attacks that are causing tremendous economic harm for all sorts of companies, from smallest to the largest. And this is the issue that I imagine would be at the top of the agenda for the discussions next week, and one that the United States, I think, will expect a resolution on, not in months or weeks, but really in days, because the issue is becoming of just extreme urgency to the United States, and the domestic political environment is such that it becomes untenable for us to continue to suffer these types of attacks without responding in a very severe fashion. And I'll just make one last point about attribution, sort of to comment on Alina's question. I'm not quite sure what she refers to as negotiations on attribution. That would be quite unprecedented. Of course, states have the right to talk about issues of concerns, to talk about spies they identify in their countries, to talk about covert actions that they see without any sort of standards. Russia does that and has done that. The United States has done that for decades. So I don't see why cyber is any different. And the whole idea that the Russian government has sometimes suggested that attribution is impossible in cyber is not only not credible, but actually I think puts Russian intelligence services in very bad light because it suggests that they're the only ones around the world who are not capable of doing attribution when virtually everyone is now in the attribution game from a nation state perspective, at least advanced countries. And it also is counterfactual given that Russian government has engaged in attribution of criminal groups. They've conducted arrests. There was a major arrest by the FSB just last year of 30 hackers of the ByBest group back in March. If attribution was impossible, I would imagine the FSB would not be arresting those hackers. Kind of the proof is in the pudding. Not to mention that there have been now numerous arrests, probably in the hundreds, if not thousands, of cyber criminals all over the world that are being done really routinely now. So attribution is a solved problem, and by the way, does not involve just technical collection. Just a simple hypothetical, if the US government is conducting, let's say, espionage attacks against the Russian government networks, and the Russian government has a spy inside the US intelligence community, as has happened on occasion, and it learns about those attacks, surely it can't claim that it's impossible for it to attribute those attacks. That's just one example of how an attack might be attributed without any need to go into technical details. So I'll leave it there and we can discuss it further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dmitry. I think a lot of for discussion. And now I give the floor, last but not the least, to Erica. I think Dmitry put already a lot of things that the United States would like to discuss with Russia. But what do you think also, what could be the incentives that the United States could provide to Moscow to cooperate on the issues of its concern? Please.
Well, thank you so much. I thank you for this opportunity to participate in this discussion. And like Dmitry, I'm speaking inherently from a U.S. perspective, but my views are personal and certainly don't reflect the views of the U.S. government. But I thought I would share, I thought I'd share some remarks, not necessarily on incentives that the U.S. government could provide, but perhaps how we could inject a bit more clarity and reduce some of the ambiguity in what I hope will be productive expert consultations on these issues in the wake of the Geneva summit. And I think, like Dmitry mentioned, clearly at the top of everyone's minds, at least in the United States, are the recent and ongoing set of cyber activities that are taking place against the private sector. And, I think this raises some concerns about what this means for the prospects of any type of cooperation or progress between the US and Russia after Geneva in the context of these expert consultations. And my sort of instinctive reaction is that is to inject a note of caution. I do think that there's a value in being careful about the inferences that we draw, at least in terms of what's been sort of publicly discussed in the media in the United States about the recent ransomware attacks and their sort of timing around the Geneva summit. I think that if you take a look at what has been reported in the US and also what Biden administration officials have said publicly, there's a lot there's a lot of information that we know, but there's also a lot that we don't yet know or don't yet have enough of to know whether the recent ransomware attack, which is clearly a significant incident, was the extent to which it was ordered by or sanctioned by the Russian government, the extent to which it may have been known sort of prior to, how long the operation was in planning for, and therefore whether its timing is meaningful, whether it was intended to be a type of signal to the United States, and if so, what the US is meant to infer from that signal. So, it's not to say that there isn't, at least from my perspective, a pretty clear and compelling US interest to reduce the magnitude and the frequency of these ransomware attacks, which have only been increasing against US companies, as well as state and local governments. Particularly concerning is ransomware against critical infrastructure. But I think that, I think that we need to be deliberate and a bit careful about assuming linkages between events that take place on the diplomatic side and things that happen in cyberspace. Not to say that they aren't always linked, but I think that a bit of caution and efforts to gain more information and clarity are useful. And my concern would be that these recent events could be used as a pretext for undermining expert consultations that both the US and Russia agreed to at Geneva. So I guess to offer some thoughts on at least from the US side, what some of the objectives might be, or how to sort of frame the conversations. And again, this is just my personal perspective. I think what would be really useful would be to get greater clarity around distinguishing between different categories of behavior, and also improving how the US government communicates what it defines as being responsible behavior, and therefore by implication, what counts as irresponsible behavior. So President Biden's statement at the Geneva summit pointing to 16 critical infrastructure sectors in the United States as being out of bounds of cyber attacks is, in my view, a step in the right direction. But one challenge is that critical infrastructure, at least as it's defined in the US, has come to mean so many different things that it ends up meaning, sometimes it ends up meaning both everything and therefore nothing. And therefore we need to get, as I mentioned, a bit more clarity. I think it's interesting to note, at least what I've seen reported in statements by US government officials, is that the most recent ransomware attack, as distinct from the Colonial Pipeline attack, didn't hit any of those 16 critical infrastructure sectors. So I think this brings up one of the challenges of defining what counts as being inbounds versus out of bounds, and how that shapes at least the US government's response. So I'm aware that my time is running short, but I guess I could briefly articulate a few different ways of delineating or defining the distinction between acceptable or unacceptable, or responsible or irresponsible behavior that could perhaps shape the expert consultations. One would be to focus on the type of target. So, this is analogous to the statement about the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. But I would suggest that expert consultations could focus on working toward agreements around perhaps particular sectors, taking a sector-specific approach rather than starting with a broader concept of critical infrastructure, and potentially use progress in a narrower sense to build on for the future. Another way to delineate boundaries, as Dimitri alluded to, is to focus on intent, particularly the difference between cyber operations conducted for espionage versus those for disruptive or destructive effects. And I think that distinction was quite muddled within the United States in terms of policy and media conversations around how to define and categorize the SolarWinds incident, which, like Dimitri, I agree, should be categorized as espionage, which is not something that is good or in a state's interest, but is distinct from things that are clearly out of bounds. But it challenges that debates around SolarWinds range from defining it as an act of war to sort of routine state cyber espionage to some other type of espionage that is somehow different and therefore bad. And then I think another way to think about delineating boundaries is to focus on the scale or the magnitude of an incident. So the scope of its effects, the extent to which it could pose broader systemic risks. I think this is particularly relevant for supply chain attacks that sort of by their very nature have large scale implications. And this SolarWinds is again relevant for sort of this delineation because the scale of the breach was one way that the Biden administration officials described the incident as being sort of a different form of cyber espionage that was therefore perhaps out of bounds. So, I'm happy to talk about all of this and what I'm sure will be a productive discussion. But, I would just conclude with saying that I think that, obviously diplomatic engagements are not alone a complete solution to addressing what are real and compelling challenges between, the United States and Russia in cyberspace. But I do think that there are some areas where hopefully there can be some more meaningful, some clearer and more detailed conversations around thinking about how to define boundaries. I'm hopeful that there will be some progress. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I've seen already that we have a very crowded and lively debate in the chat, and for example, about the issue of attribution. It is expected that when the professionals in cyber and internet and information security issues, they could use Zoom very effectively. But I would also encourage those who haven't done it to post your questions and comments, and we will try to collect as many of them as possible. I also saw that Tinatin already came up with a new question, but let me remind you of the one that was promised, that Andrei promised that we will discuss in our session. And Erica already started answering it, but maybe some other participants could also comment. How do you assess the prospects of bilateral talks? Do you expect much from them? Please, who would like to respond to that?
Well, I can start maybe. I think, as I mentioned, there are issues that I think on cybercrime there is greatest possibility of progress. I think it's a significant change that previously there was any kind of cyber attack was attributed to Russia in some way, and the natural response of Russian officials was that Russia has nothing to do with it. Even when Russian government was not kind of blamed for it, Russian officials would say Russia has nothing to do with it. So I think that deliberate effort by the Biden administration to signal that we do not consider some attacks as attributable to Russian government opens an opportunity for discussion. So I think here we can do a lot of, well, some progress, and it will be tough. There are many obstacles, political, technical, well, maybe not so technical, but trust, political, information sharing obstacles. But they can, in principle, be overcome. And I think because it's early in the Biden administration, I think there is an expectation on both sides that some progress will be done. On the rest, I think there are many complications to discussing critical infrastructure. Like I'm all for ensuring that critical infrastructure is off the limits for cyber attacks. But there is really little trust on the Russian side for this, because just to remind our American colleagues, there are serious concerns in Russia about US activities in this space. So in 2019, it was reported by the New York Times that US implanted some kind of malicious code in Russian power grid to trigger in case there was something. And basically, it's even though it was not, it was debated by President Trump at the time. It's kind of not, it wouldn't be surprised for Russian officials if this was the case. So, and last year it was reported that CIA actually, that Trump administration expanded CIA authorities, which allowed them to attack some types of critical infrastructure, and Russia is one of the potential targets for these attacks. So, so it's kind of hard to discuss this in a way when the United States blames Russia, but there are not public, but publicly discussed documents in the United States that say it's okay to attack some countries' critical infrastructure. So in this space, I think there will be much more contention and more debate. And I don't expect it to be a kind of comprehensive deal after all, but I think there will be some progress.
Yeah.
Thank you, Helene. Yeah, please.
May I also add, global information sphere and information security now are the most pressing threats for the international stability, and Russia and the United States are among the most prominent players in this area. So I believe that bilateral consultations will add predictability to the relationship among these states, and this is very important by itself for the international peace and stability. And Russia has been very active, Russian diplomats, in promoting international norms, principles, rules, which would be negotiated on a global basis and on bilateral ones. And establishing a mechanism for information sharing would add to predictability and thus to the security both in bilateral and global information sphere and international relations in general. So I believe this is the most important outcome, although there are very many issues which already have to be negotiated, and creating a mechanism for information exchange and cooperation in this issue is very important. So this is my short comment on the issue.
Thank you. And Dmitry, you put a laundry list of problems. Maybe what are your expectations about solving them in some kind of further talk?
I'm not sure about expectations, but I'll just say this. I think on the ransomware problem, which is becoming not just a national security issue, but a political issue domestically for President Biden, given the economic impact and the news headlines that it's causing. The Colonial Pipeline operation caused... Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, go on, please. We hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, so the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack caused people to flood gas stations all over the East Coast, causing gas shortages that affected millions of Americans. Those types of attacks cannot be allowed to continue. President Biden will be under tremendous pressure from Congress, from both parties to do something about this. We have an election season that's going to start shortly for the upcoming midterms. And the American side will expect, as I said, rapid action from Russian government officials to prosecute criminals that are conducting these attacks from Russian soil. Again, there's no accusation that the Russian government is involved in any of these attacks, but there's considerable evidence, including public indictments of Russian criminals that have been part of these operations, and the US government will demand quite swift actions. And I fear that if that swift action does not come, there will be severe consequences for the overall relationship between the US and Russia.
Thank you. I think we had several questions actually about ransomware attacks. So your last comment, I think, partially answers to them, and also some of the discussion of the chat, I think, clears some of the issues that were raised. For example, William Courtney was asking about the potentially more publicly visible responses on behalf of the US to ransomware attacks. And also before that, Ivan Zaplatkin was asking our, I believe, American colleagues regarding the scale of these attacks and the severity of the problem, but he later dropped this question after the clarifications in the chat. But this also brings the question, I think, to the Russian participants and to Russian speakers, because our participants from the US are speaking a lot about this issue. What do you think? To what extent this could be a problem for the Russian side, and to what extent it is perceived as a problem on the Russian side? Oleg, would you like to jump in on that?
Can you repeat? Had some confusion.
The ransomware attacks about which our American colleagues are speaking quite significantly. To what extent do you think on the Russian side this is believed to be an important issue for negotiations and an important problem?
Yeah, thanks. So I think there are definitely ransomware attacks, but it's not. There is a it's very asymmetric in terms of. I don't know about attacks, but about publicizing these attacks. So in Russia, we don't. The reporting about cyber attacks is not as detailed and extensive as in the United States. So one conclusion could be that there are less of such attacks. Another conclusion could be that organizations are less willing to share information. But we know that there was a last fall there was an attack on a clinic in Sverdlovsk region, a ransomware attack. So also Sergei Rybkov mentioned some kind of attack on healthcare sector in Voronezh region. We know that cybersecurity companies report about increased frequency of such attacks on Russian organizations, but I think it's not we shouldn't look for kind of symmetry in this regard because it would be kind of a false pursuit because we have other concerns on the Russian side. We have these political concerns about the US use of these techniques. We have other concerns that would hardly be possible to discuss in these negotiations. So Russian officials, Russian security officials in particular, they are very concerned about the use of Western technologies in general, the use of like Western software. We have this import substitution in IT, and this is in part inspired by well, I don't know about Snowden leaks, but in general about the concerns that there are some backdoors and we do not ultimately control it. So I think that these concerns are symmetric, but of course there are ransomware attacks in Russia too, and if this cooperation could help mitigate or like prevent or respond to some ransomware attacks in Russia, that would be helpful too. But again, we haven't heard this as much as we heard about attacks in the United States. But this should not be interpreted as if I'm saying that because there are less observed cases in Russia, we should not treat it as important. Maybe we'll see more of them as we move further.
Thank you so much, Dmitry. You want to respond?
Well, I just want to make a comment, and this is just a factual comment, that a lot of the criminal malware that is being distributed these days and has been for about 10 years now includes an exclusion that if it's running on a computer that has a Russian language installed on it, it will not execute. So that might be one of the reasons why there is relatively little criminal activity in Russia. It's not all malware, and there are certainly exceptions, but a lot of it has those exclusions. And I'll leave it as an exercise to the reader of why that may be the case.
Thank you so much. In the title of our session, we have two words, cyber and information security. And it's precisely because there are also differences in terminology. So one of the questions by Noma Zarubina comes more on information security than pretty technical terms. She asks how possible is to prevent what she calls Russophobia in media, even in the biggest newspapers and electronic media which influence public opinion. Russian community struggles with informational attacks and disinformation, especially in the internet in the United States. If there are any comments by our speakers or responses.
I mean, I guess I can offer some initial thoughts, although they're not quite so well formed. So I apologize in advance for that. But you know, I'm sensitive and empathetic to the challenges of how a distorted information environment can shape public opinion, and particularly in the United States, where public opinion is you know such an important you know part of our domestic politics and shaping how political leaders you know make policy decisions. I think this is certainly a challenge. I think that it's a challenge that you know that the United States has not quite figured out how to solve, and I think it manifests in lots of different ways, not just in terms of hype that or sort of speculation that may take place in the media, but sort of more challenging and corrosive for our democracy is how you know is sort of you know how the information environment gets distorted by you know and distorted by you know both foreign and domestic actors. And so I would offer that I don't have a solution, but this is a challenge that that has been particularly acute for quite some time, and I think that I don't think that the way that our government is structured and the relationship between the state and society is structured, that we have quite yet figured out how to improve on this. Those are my ill-formed reaction to the question.
I would add a couple of words maybe on my side. So I looked into some ways where you could tackle these like misperceptions and how other countries are represented. And also, I think John Mallory wrote on chat about restraining from some kind of disinformation. So I think it's very difficult to conceptualize politically. So, for example, Russia proposed to adapt mutual guarantees of non-interference. I think it will be very hard to do in practice. But what I think is possible is if there are some discussions among diplomats, some might be confidential discussions where they can share that, look, we are really concerned about you doing this and that, and we hope you could reconsider doing this. And this will not be in any way binding, but this will be kind of a way to signal to the other side without publicly shaming and blaming that we don't want you to do this, and then it will remain to the other side whether they don't want to stop doing something. So this is the only way I can see it. So basically the solution, not an ultimate solution, but to have some kind of confidential exchange where this could be raised, because whenever it's raised publicly, there is a lot of defensive reaction, and it's difficult to solve anything.
Thank you so much. We again have several very interesting questions from John Mallory, but maybe I will take one of them, and then if we exhaust questions from other participants, we will come back to the others. So John asked, can the US and Russia negotiate limitations on hostile cyber operations against each other, rules of the road for cyber espionage and preparation of the battlefield, especially in critical infrastructure? And I think also in the chat, Dmitry mentioned that basically 16 issue areas of critical infrastructure. This list basically covers everything. And we have no distinction between critical infrastructure then and non-critical infrastructure. So how do you think it also affects the probability of creating some common rules of the road? The question is obviously for all the participants, not only for Dmitry.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce the point, and this was widely misunderstood, I think, both on the Russian side and the American side, but the list of 16 sectors is really an internal organizational concept within the US government in terms of figuring out which part of US government will engage with which part of industry to discuss cyber issues. So almost by design, it literally covers every business on the planet, from your dry cleaner to your movie theater to your casino to pretty much anything. You'd be hard pressed to think of anything that is not covered in those 16 sectors, and I'm not sure that that actually exists. But how to define critical infrastructure obviously is a challenge for every country, because sometimes companies that play a very critical role either on the IT side or on the physical infrastructure side are not even well known because they're not sort of public names that play a very sort of forward-leaning role in critical infrastructure, but maybe a necessary cog in the wheel that if it's removed, everything else collapses. And you know, most countries don't even understand that those internal interactions well themselves, much less are able to articulate them to others. But certainly there are major pipelines, major nuclear power plants and the like that are very easy to define.
If I could just jump in and add to Dmitry's comments, there has been a work in the United States to have clear definitions of what counts as actually sort of systemically important critical infrastructure, which would be sort of a narrower aperture than the 16 critical infrastructure sectors that are defined in an executive order. I do think, though, that in terms of thinking about where there might be opportunities for making progress, I sort of alluded to this in my remarks. I think that identifying specific sectors of critical infrastructure where there are more more sort of obvious and clearer mutual interests could perhaps be a starting point for discussion where there are greater chances of at least arriving at some type of consensus. So I think an obvious one, and one where I believe both the UN OEWG and the GGE both reflected their final consensus statements on, has to do with the healthcare sector in light of the pandemic and the shared interest that that nearly every country around the world has in cyber attacks that could disrupt critical healthcare services, vaccine distribution, information, distorted influence operations around vaccine reliability and things like that. And so, I think taking a sector by sector approach rather than sort of a broad critical infrastructure designation would be useful. I think another area, which is perhaps less obvious, I don't know, is sort of the financial sector, given that sort of given that the financial sector is inherently a global system that is deeply interdependent, and where states that participate in it have a shared interest in its continued integrity and stability. That could be another area where there's opportunity for cooperation, or at least perhaps not cooperation, but at least some type of meaningful consensus or agreement or clarity on acceptable versus unacceptable behavior. So the more we can get towards sort of narrowing the scope and focusing on sort of smaller subsets of problems, I think is most conducive to productive consultations.
To the same question on critical infrastructure. So I think there was some misunderstanding even in Russia and the United States about these 16 sectors, but basically I wrote when it was reported that it was CISA's 16 sectors, etc. So in Russia, we don't have the same list, but we have sort of 13 areas which largely overlap, and I would argue they also cover most of organizations in Russia. But there are several challenges. So I think one challenge is when you discuss critical infrastructure. So you discuss we should not attack critical infrastructure, but basically you're deciding what you are allowed to attack. Because if you exclude critical infrastructure, then you allow attacks on something, and this is tricky. Second, we have different lists, of course, which can also be tricky. So in my understanding, and this is of course not an official position, but I think this discussion will have to focus on specific areas. So one area I think it could focus on is what Russians call for, Russian diplomats and Russian military, is this some kind of agreement on incident prevention. They argue that it should be modeled on the 1972 Incidents at Sea agreement, which is difficult, but you can see some small parallels. And in particular, you can agree not to attack national technical means, basically satellites, because it has direct implications for strategic stability. And you can agree not to attack them in any way, including by cyber means. So this is one area, very narrow, very specific. Maybe it has to do more with what we discussed in the first session. Second, I think maybe recalling what Ellen Nakashima wrote here about some kind of threshold. So maybe what can be discussed is in what areas there is a greater possibility of human life losses, and this could be a priority. So hospitals would be one, electric grid another one. Then another area could be financial sector, because everyone depends on it, and there was a lot of work actually done at Carnegie by Erica's colleague who left for the Department of Justice now on financial sector. So I think this could be another area. So I think, of course, on the Russian side, we have not heard such prioritization yet. But if we think of some practical outcome, I think there is no other way than to, well, one way would be to basically confirm, confirm GG report and say that, yes, we agree this multilateral, now we agree bilateral that we should not attack critical infrastructure, full stop, without specifications. But if you want to go further, then there is no other way than to look at specific sectors, because either you take 16 US sectors or 13 Russian areas. It's not practical to go forward.
Can I just say, to Erica's point earlier, I think the focus on the targets is a rat hole that no country really wants to go into, because defining this is impossible and the list will constantly be changing. I think it's much more important to focus on effects. Destroying anything, in my view, in peacetime is unacceptable. I don't care if it's your major top 10 bank or if it's a dry cleaner around the corner. Even though the nation state impact will be very different, clearly that is not an activity that anyone is going to tolerate. And I think that's how we should be thinking about these cyber problems. Is it espionage for national security purposes, which no one is going to like, but everyone's going to say is acceptable? Is it economic espionage, which is really economic warfare and unfair trade practices? Or is it destructive attacks that are taking down businesses or schools or kindergartens or what have you?
Thank you so much. It's kind of really fascinating discussion. I think, unfortunately, we lost Helena, maybe due to technical difficulties somewhere along the way, but maybe she will come back, or we have anyway some limited time, so maybe she won't be able to do it. So maybe one of the last questions that we will be able to tackle, and there is once again a lot of questions about attribution. Tinatin Japaridze was asking if Moscow continues to insist that attribution is challenging, if not impossible, and persists with claims that none of the attacks we've discussed during the conversation were in fact of the Russian state's doing, then how can we proceed with tangible dialogue beyond mere diplomatic talks that go nowhere fast? Taking no responsibility appears to be a dialogue killer then and there. So what do you think about this question of taking responsibility by either side for the attacks that the other side accuses of?
I mean, I can start. I think we should distinguish in this Russian criticism about attribution. We should distinguish between two parts. So one is whether attribution is possible, and here we heard from Dmitry, and we know that Russian law enforcement prosecutes cyber criminals. So I think to a large extent, Russian officials, maybe not in the foreign ministry, but in different agencies, they would definitely agree that in some cases it's definitely possible. But according to some data, there is a very low success rate in cybercrime investigations, so it's not definitely possible all the time. But the second part is maybe the controversial part about publicly accepting responsibility. And in this regard, I understand the frustration of the Americans that they don't hear some kind of responsibility statements from Russia. But to be fair, there is no like precedent for states taking responsibility for actions taken in cyberspace. So even the most well-studied case of Stuxnet, no one kind of officially took responsibility for it. So I would say that it's not kind of an aberration that states are not taking responsibility for acts that are publicly attributed to them. Maybe we can talk about some private responsibility. Maybe some of this can be discussed in private, but I think as we go forward, it will remain kind of maybe not a norm, but a commonplace practice that states would deny any responsibility for cyber attacks. That actually we see some on the United States, they would publicly report attacks against ISIS, for example, which is non-controversial. You fight terrorists, good stuff. So Cyber Command even disclosed some information under the FOIA request. So here you go. And Russia might like disclose something in the future regarding cyber criminals or terrorists. But I think it's impossible to demand countries to disclose something in this like very uncertain domain about actions against other states that where you can basically deny someone else's accusations.
Let me just respond to that. I think it's a mistake to assume that the United States is looking for Russia to somehow do a mea culpa and admit to all the cyber attacks that they've been engaged in. I don't think anyone is expecting that. I don't think anyone is even asking for that. I think the conversations are more about the future and signaling to the Russian Federation that we do have attribution capabilities. We know you're behind this, down to very detailed accusations of people involved, specific units of military intelligence or other intelligence services. So we can track you, and we're asking you to stop and cease this activity going forward. So I don't think that there's going to be a demand from the Biden administration. I could be wrong, but my personal view is there's not going to be a demand to get Russia to admit that they were interfering in the US election in 2016 or were responsible for NotPetya or any one of those things. I think it's going to be much more future focused and trying to stem future activity.
Can I also just add very quickly, I know we're over time and I'm sure we have other commitments, but I agree completely with what Dmitry said. I would also just add, I think we shouldn't neglect the fact that public attribution on the part of the United States also serves domestic political purposes, as well as helps facilitate cooperation between the US and its allies and partners in terms of addressing malicious cyber activity. So it's, you know, these types of actions have sort of multifaceted purposes and sort of have different roles for different audiences.
Thank you so much. It's 6:02 or 3 actually on my clock. So I failed with my most important role as a moderator of timekeeping. I'm sorry for that. I'm also sorry for all those whose questions I've missed for some reason, wasn't able to ask. We had a kind of several conversations going on in the same time, including some of them in the chat, and I'm sorry if I mixed and missed something. Thank you so much to all the speakers for fascinating comments. It was very thought-provoking. I have a lot to digest after this conversation. Thank you to all participants. I hope you liked this seminar and you will continue to join for the seminars organized by MGIMO. And thank you so much to Andrei for bringing such great 2 panels together.
Thank you. And I'll just to finalize say we haven't solved all the problems today, but we might have mapped some ideas on where all this might go. So this was helpful for me personally. I hope it was interesting for everyone involved. On behalf of the Center for Advanced American Studies, thanks to all of the speakers, to both moderators. Igris, you did great, I personally think. Commentator, participants, and of course, all of my MGIMO colleagues. And I hope to see you again in our future events. Thank you.